Hemi Joel here at the Hidden Lake Horsepower Farm. I'm getting ready to pull the 392 Hemi out of the hot rod. At sick week, it sheared off the oil pump drive shaft, and I got to freshen this thing up and fix a few things. No serious damage though, nothing to worry about. But I get a lot of questions and comments about the 8 carb intake that I run on this thing, and the most common question is why. I don't know, glutton for punishment. I just think it's cool. People say, oh, it's got to be a nightmare to tune. Well, you would think if you could tune one old Ford carburetor, it would not be any more complicated to tune 8 of them. And I thought that at first too, but it actually is a lot more complicated. I don't know why. Just if something goes wrong, you got to figure out which one has something wrong, rather than just knowing that there's only one of them to deal with. So first, I'll tell you about this intake. This is a Edelbrock X3, which has a very interesting story. Vic Edelbrock Sr. designed this manifold for the 392 Hemi back in 1960 for SK boat racing, and it's a cross ram. Originally they had 6 carburetors on them, and the tube length is designed to give the engine a lot of mid-range power for pulling out of the corners as they raced around buoys or something out there on the lake. But they soon discovered that 6 carburetors weren't enough, so they cut the tops off of 15 of them, welded a plate on there, and put 8 carburetors on them, and that's when the Hemis started winning. So I was very fortunate to find one of those 15. It had been modified a little bit, but that was corrected. So I'll tell you about the carburetors. These are Holley 94s. They're 1 1/16 inch Venturi, which was the largest one available. That came off of mid-50s Y-block powered Ford trucks, so they all got the Ford badge on them. It wasn't easy to find the match set. So these are 2-barrel carburetors. I've got the frog's mouth scoops on them because I like the look of them. Oops, I had one off. Okay, when I'm on the drag strip, I just rely on these screens to keep the big chunks out. But when I'm on the street, I put these filters on that I got from Speedway, trying to do it one-handed. And then I got a bungee cord that I put on there just to make sure they don't get lost. These things are really restrictive, but with 8 of them going down the road, it doesn't seem to make a difference, and I'm not flooring it when I'm on the street. Okay, so the carburetors are set up so that the center 4 are primary and the outer 4 are secondary. The secondary carburetors don't have an idle circuit, so the idle screw holes are plugged. On the primaries, each of them has got 2 idle mixture screws. I use a jam nut instead of a spring because they were rattling around with just a spring. So each carburetor has 2 main jets. That makes 16 main jets total. To access them normally you could just take a plug out that's right here and reach in there with a screwdriver and take it out, but the other carburetors are in the way. So to change all the jets, you'd have to take off 6 of the carburetors, and that's no good when you're racing and you need to change your mixture. So I put in these adjustable main jet screws. They replace the plug, and they have a long screw that goes through the fuel bowl underneath the float and all the way up to the main jets, and then there's a point that goes in the main jet like a needle, and I just loosen the jam nut and thread them out to rich in the mixture and thread them in to lean out the mixture. These screws I bought off the internet, and they had hex heads on them, and with hex heads I kept losing track of where the screw was when I was adjusting them. So what I did, is you'd probably want to do the same thing, is I ground them flat on one side and the other, and then I painted one side black and the other side white, so it's real easy for me to keep track of them and keep them all the same as long as I don't lose my concentration while I'm doing all 16. That takes me about a half an hour. If I'm at the track adjusting these, don't come and start asking me questions or I'll lose track. So the linkage, okay, this is made up out of stainless steel rod. This is 5/16 30 thousandths wall stainless tubing with 1032 threaded rod inside. So each piece basically have the stainless tube, piece of rod inside, some jam nuts, and some rod ends. So these are just cut to the length that I need them, and I can do final adjusting just by threading one rod end in or out. On the fuel line setup, I started out with the more traditional banjo fittings at each carb inlet and one line that went all the way through all 4 carbs on each side, but I had problems with that. I don't think it was getting enough fuel in the carbs. It was leaning out on the top end of the drag strip. And the other problem is, to remove them, you had to thread in and out of a fitting in the carb tops, and they kept coming loose and they were leaking. And these old pop metal carb tops, the threads are very fragile. So I ended up switching over to these AN fittings that I got from Fragola, and I can just thread these on and off really quickly without disturbing the threads, because those stay in there, and I got them JB welded in so they won't move and they won't tear up the threads, and I can have these off in a matter of seconds if I need to get a carb top off. Then so I got them set up in pairs, so each side has 2 pairs going down through lines through a Y fitting there and to the fuel pressure regulator, and there's one bank going into each side of the fuel pressure regulator, and then the main fuel line going back to the fuel pump. I got a fuel pressure gauge mounted right there, and there's the adjustment, so I can get it set for 6 psi as the usual. It's about as much as what these carburetors are good for. On the linkage, so it's set up progressive. This slider right here allows the center 4 carburetors to open close to halfway. And then when it hits that stop, it starts pushing the front carburetors open, and they all reach wide open throttle at the same time because the length of this is figured out for that. And then the motion from this one's transferred back to the rear carburetors, and the motion from that one transfers back to that carburetor there, and this picks up its motion from this rod going up to this arm, which is on a jack shaft. And the jack shaft is mounted on some aluminum plates that are mounted on the carb studs, and some rod ends, spherical rod ends that hold that all together. Nystrom Performance made up these levers on the jack shaft for me, because initially I had this kind of little lever on there and they were slipping on the shaft, fouling everything up. So Nystrom made up the wide one, heavy duty, with 2 screws on it. They don't slip. In the center of the jack shaft, Nystrom also made up this really cool lever. So the bottom of it is where the throttle return springs mount, and they go up to this eye bolt that's on a little cross member there. And then this rod goes back to the throttle arm that goes through the firewall down to the gas pedal. Really important, this stop screw. So when you get wide open throttle, that hits that screw and stops the pressure of your foot from trying to force the carburetors open any further. And this can be adjusted up and down. Just loosen the jam nut and adjust it so that it hits that at the exact same time that the carburetors are at wide open throttle. If all the pressure of your foot is going against these arms, the stops inside the carburetor keep the shaft from twisting, but it pulls these arms on the shaft, it slips, and then it gets all fouled up. It doesn't want to return to idle, or whatever one slips won't return to idle. So if you're setting one of these up, put some kind of a stop in there. Having a 5/16 ratcheting box end wrench with a string tied on it, okay, that's for taking the mounting bolts for the intake on and off, okay? So what happens, sometimes it'll slip out of your hand, it'll fall down there in the valley and go somewhere where it's really hard to get out. So with the string, you can pull it right out. So you want to have a string on that because that valley's real hard to get into on this setup. You do it and learn how to do it as you go. Oh, I probably forgot to cover something, but I can always add it later if need be. If you have any questions, go ahead and ask. I'll do anything I can to help. Okay, thanks for stopping.